Good morning, everyone. I'm Molly Starback, Director of the Duke Office of Postdoctoral Services, and I'd like to welcome you to the first panel of the Academic Job Search Series. This is a series co-sponsored by my office, by the Career Center, and the Graduate School. Today's discussion is behind the scenes with the Search Committee. We'll be talking about the application process, what the Search Committee looks for in application documents, the screening process, what successful candidates felt that they did well and maybe not so well, and selecting candidates to interview. So next Thursday, September 12th, same time, same room, right here, we're holding a panel on the interview process, and I know a lot of you have questions about the interview that you submitted online for today's session, but I'd ask you to hold on to those for next week's session so we can get through the CV and application documents today. Also upcoming in the series are workshops on how to construct your CV, cover letter, research and teaching statements, and negotiating a job offer. For dates and times, you can go to the Postdoc Services website, postdoc.duke.edu, and look for the academic series on the calendar. So I would like to very much thank our faculty panelists for taking time out of their schedules, especially because it's a very busy time, the first couple of weeks of classes, and joining us here today. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with our postdocs and graduate students. So our panelists are Patrick Charbonneau, Assistant Professor of Chemistry, Micah Luftig, Assistant Professor of Molecular Genetics and Microbiology, Ann West, Associate Professor of Neurobiology and the Duke University Postdoc Advisor, yay, and Jennifer West, Professor of Biomedical Engineering. So I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves, briefly talk about how they've been involved in faculty searches, or for the more recent candidates, what the search was like for them. And then we'll start with questions. As I said, a number of you submitted questions online, so thank you for doing that. We'll start with those, but feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. So, would you like to start, Patrick?
Sure. So hi, thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was on the job market 6 years ago now, which seems a bit long now, but it's still fresh to my memory in many ways. And I was a postdoc like you, but I was a postdoc in Europe at the time. So it was quite a different experience to apply for jobs, not being in the in crowd, in a sense, right? Not having a panel like this one to discuss and to hear about how people do it. So I had to guess and rely on. But anyways, I did apply for 50 faculty positions, got a handful of interviews, 2 offers, and I'm here. And that's how I get this till down. And we can talk about all aspects of this if you're interested in, but I also want to give you an idea of what I've seen on the other side, and then when it comes to questions. So I've not been on the search committee so far, but I've seen the internal working of the departments trying to come up with or to generate a search, right? And all the politics that go behind this. And then the idea of a funnel of going from 50 applications to a handful of interviews start to make sense. Because you think that you're applying to a 50 faculty position, but there may not be actually 50 faculty position in the first place. And what's written in the offer, or in the advertisement, may not really have much to do with what they really are looking for, interestingly enough. So I've seen this process, and if you want it to be debunked, we can explore the various aspects. And then very, very recently, I've started to be on the other side of this, because yesterday I received the first request for a letter from my first graduate student, who is now a postdoc at Yale, and who's asking for letters of recommendation for a faculty position. And interestingly enough, he didn't tell me he was applying for faculty positions this year, so he and I had a long Skype chat yesterday afternoon, telling him how everything he's been doing wrong in preparing for his application. So that's my background. That's where I stand on this landscape.
Micah?
Okay. Again, thanks for inviting me, and welcome. I also have been here 6 years, and interestingly enough, I also did my postdoc in Europe, despite the fact that I'm American, and so that's a little bit awkward. But so I guess I was in the in crowd, but then I came back from, and so I have a different vantage point. So second to a lot of what you're saying. I have sat on a search committee for our department in the past year, which was one that was actually focused. So it was focused on my expertise, which is in virology. So it's a little bit of a niche search, which is actually something that I think is really important to try to be able to recognize early on, is what the niche is versus the searches that are very broad and looking for the so-called best athletes or whatever you want to call it. And so I've seen and been involved in a number of searches in our department as well, and it's a challenging process. So look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Anne?
So I was applying for jobs 8 years ago, and my weird story is that I never actually went on the job market. I did kind of a longish postdoc. I was in a postdoc feeder lab. It was a big lab. Everybody was going to faculty positions. So it was a great environment to be in, a very lucky environment to be in. So I was in that. I was sort of still early on getting ready to apply. I was going to plan another year. And there was the department here had wanted to hire the guy that I was working for and tried to get him to come here to be the chair. And when he chose not to come, they then said, well, is there anybody else from your lab who might be interested in coming down here? And so it was one of these sort of arranged marriages. And so I came down at the end of the search when it was pretty much they'd seen everybody. And I came in and gave a talk and was offered the job within a couple of weeks. And so it was a really great, lucky situation. The thing about that is that I think it does point out sort of exactly what you've been hearing, which is a search can be, now I've been on several search committees and about to be another one, and my department's been searching a lot over the past few years. But you can set out in a search with the best of intentions of what you think you want. And then you bring people in and you realize, we weren't very smart about that. Actually, what we think we want doesn't exist out there. We had a search like that. Whole search failed. Went through hundreds of applications, rejected many candidates, brought in 7 people and didn't like any of them. We're like, wow, actually, this was not a good idea. And so then, somebody comes in from out of the blue and you're like, oh, well, that's a great idea. It wasn't what we were thinking about, but actually that looks really exciting. So I've known a lot of people to whom that's actually happened, spousal hires in particular, where they're going after one spouse. The second one comes in and they go, oh, that happened to us last year. We hired one spouse, and then the second one, they said, oh, we have this second person. That person came in, we're like, oh, we really like that person. But she wasn't applying, she wasn't applying yet because it was still early for her. So these hoping for the random interconnection, these are very personal searches, exactly what you do and exactly what they're looking for. And so just making those connections and being there and doing everything you can to make sure that people know who you are and what you are. Maybe you are what they want and they just don't know it. So but you somehow or other have to get recognized that way. So,
So I've only been at Duke for a year. I just moved here from Rice University. So at Rice I had been department chair, and so I had been involved in many faculty searches there. So I figured out I've been on 14 faculty searches there. So we've seen kind of the gamut, and some of those were assistant professor searches, some of those were full professor searches. So we've kind of seen a full range. Also, there was always a rule that any search committee had to have a member from a different department on it, so I've also sat on other department search committees. And one of the things you see is that different departments have different hiring practices and different customs. Application packages look very different in different disciplines. So like a math application looks entirely different than a chemistry application, which looks very different than a biology application. And a biology application looks very different in an academic department than in a medical school department. So you really have to know that you have to understand where you're applying, and now that people do very interdisciplinary work, oftentimes you're applying to different kinds of departments, and you often have to customize your application for the different kinds of departments you might be sending your application to. So you have to kind of be aware of that there are different search practices going on in different departmental cultures. So keep that in mind. And then from my lab, I've also had, at this point, 22 people go on to faculty positions, but I've also seen kind of perspective of people out interviewing and going through the process and having to kind of negotiate the waters going through that way. So just this last year, we had 4 people go into faculty positions. We've seen, a lot of people having to go through that process very recently.
Okay, so it sounds like nobody has the magical algorithm for how to get people hired. All right. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about how search committees are set up? Some of you have mentioned that.
So it's going to be different in different universities and different kinds of departments within universities. So every place is going to have different rules, basically. But in general, it's going to be faculty from that department. Oftentimes, though, there will be rules that there have to be some other representatives also. Sometimes it's just the chair gets to appoint them, sometimes the dean appoints them. So there will be different rules depending on what school you're looking at. So there's no one answer to that, but it's generally going to be a body of faculty.
And Patrick, you mentioned writing the job announcement. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
But can I continue
Oh, yeah,
under comments? So yeah, I mean, it's true that each committee is a reflection of the culture of the institution and of the department in which it's being set up. And that culture can work or can not work. There are some dysfunctional departments out there, and there's some that are really well run, and that will be reflected in how the job process goes. There are departments that are fighting, right? Where there's internal feuds between subdivisions of the department, and that can bring it all the way to the job search, right? So it's in a sense, that's one of the reasons why the department keeps on failing, because they can't actually go for success. They go for internal politics over their hiring process. And often departments have an internal dynamics, right? Of who has. So even though there's a job search in a certain area, there's a certain understanding that there's a turn for people to dominate the search. A senior faculty has been promised this in the past, it didn't happen. Now, well, a compensation of a different type needs to come on, and that is reflected in the composition of the committee. Right? And in the end, who are the strong personalities? Who are the leaders? Who are the heavy players in the department can dictate how the committee will function. So that's part of it, and that's what I want to say, and that's what I wanted to express in a sense in saying that you're not really applying for as many positions as you think you are, because there are so many rules that you have no way of ever understanding to see how a department functions and what are their internal issues. And sometimes there's a search that has not been approved by the higher administration. Right? So the search doesn't really exist. It's called a stealth search. Right?
And that didn't used to happen much in the budget cuts the last few years. That's been more common, where they have to get the ads out to be in the hiring cycle, but they're still negotiating with the upper administration. We never saw that until the last few years, and then the budget's getting really tight. The last few years, you have seen cases where the budgets didn't come together, and schools didn't actually end up interviewing any of the candidates.
Or even
worse.
Yeah.
Or worse, they did,
And then they couldn't take it on. Yeah.
Or sometimes they don't even make an offer. They just decide to conduct some interviews without calling them interviews, just inviting people, right? To come and give talks and hope that there will be enough enthusiasm generated out of this that they can spin it into a search.
By the way, you should still take advantage of those opportunities.
Absolutely.
Because if you happen to be the perfect person, it might just happen, right? It's not to say that, somebody, you hope they're straightforward with you. And you say, well, this is, might be a search, it might not be a search, but we're interested in you. That's good. Once you get them hooked, then the money will happen.
And sometimes schools will interview a whole slate of candidates and choose not to make an offer, and it's not that they didn't have the money. We have actually, in my department in the past, had a whole slate of interviews and just decided we flat out didn't like any of them, and we're not going to make offers to them because we don't want them in our department. That is not the same thing. That is just we had the money, we just simply didn't like them. That's different.
Do you want to take questions from the audience?
Hey, do we have it? Yes.
Yeah, and just because we were already in the topic of failing interviews or failing searches. So, I mean, what would be your thoughts when they say that the search failed probably more because of a politic issue than, that the candidates were not, whatever, it's not a personal thing with the candidates. So what would be your thoughts about a reapplication to that same position that eventually opens a few months later? And so, somebody got invited to an interview, the search failed in the end because politics within the department, they advertised again the position. So, what's your thoughts about going back and, reapplying to that position, and what's probably the best approach in terms of preparing the application package? So, you had a chance again to get into the interview, if you still think there's that fit within the
If they already interviewed you, they probably will not interview you again, because they've already seen you, they know what you are. Of course, it doesn't hurt, in most cases, it's an online application, so it's only your time to go in and resubmit it. You can update it with, all your new publications and point out what's changed about you since you interviewed. But it's pretty unlikely that they're going to re-interview you.
What if they have an entirely new search committee?
They still, when you interview, you meet all of their faculty. So whoever they put on the search committee, they've met you. So they're going to feel like they know you.
Obviously, in the situation where the dean or the position, the funding drives up for that position or whatever it is, or where they offer it to somebody else and the negotiations fall through and then they bring it back, and you were one of the top candidates and you stay in contact and they basically say, apply again. We're looking, we're interested in you.
They're going to be calling you.
They'll call you. They'll get in touch with you and say, please put your application in again. So you'll know.
If the job advertisement, just so we were talking about the job ad, and so maybe we can bring that up. So what does the text of the ad actually say? And so some ads, as Molly said, are very broad, very wide open. We're looking for somebody with expertise in cell biology, genetics, biochemistry, whatever. And they'll say something really broad like that. Others, the failed search that we had one time, it said, we're looking for people who do local neural circuit control of behavior. That's a very specific thing you're looking for. So you can sometimes, if the job ad switches, like for instance, after our local neural circuit control of behavior search, the next search was, we're looking for somebody who's interested in neurobiology. And then took the broad perspective. So therefore, if the job ad description has switched, and you think you still fit, you might as well apply again, because maybe the applications were being screened one way initially and screened a different way the second time. If the job ad is really the same, you probably were screened the first time. You can still apply, but you've got to admit that your chances aren't that strong. People do remember. There's not that many applicants. They're likely to remember you.
But the question is if you interviewed already.
If you interview, then no luck. Yeah, it's not worth it. I mean,
and they are calling you back anyway. But
So if you had just applied, I would completely apply again. But if you've interviewed, they're going to completely remember it. They really have all the information. Because when you interview, it is an extremely in-depth process.
the only other thing about the job ad, since we have mentioned that again, you should probably pay some attention to what it says. If they say we want this kind of person or that kind of person. But if you think that in any way, shape, or form you might fall into that category, you probably still apply. Because frequently what happens is, the search committee thinks they want this kind of person, but your application comes in so much better than the applications they got for the things that they put out there. They're more interested in you in the end than what they actually were looking for. And you don't know the composition of the search committee, and probably even they don't, and who's going to be really strong on it. So it is useful to, okay, don't apply for something that you're completely irrelevant for, but don't take it too seriously. Be willing to apply for something. They'll just won't interview you if they're not interested in who you are, but you should still interview if you think you might fit under the category.
So given that you've got a stack of applications, what's the most important part, or is there one of most, the CV, the cover letter, the research statement, the reference letters, or does it depend on which faculty member is looking?
Probably depends. I think a lot of times, now that things are electronic, that a lot of times the cover letters don't necessarily get read now. I think that the reference letters are pretty significantly important. Your CV, of course, your accomplishments are going to be incredibly important. You know, your publication record, whether you've gotten fellowships, all those things are going to be incredibly important. So.
I mean, the cover letter is there to tie it together. If there's something that somehow does not, I mean, you can read a CV, and we all, you know, at this point, if you look at 100 CV, you know, you can read a life, right? It's pretty, we've seen many scientists, we look at their CVs online, and we compare with our peers all the time. So when we look at CVs, we sort of know the story it tells. If your story is slightly different for some reason than what your CV may suggest, that's probably where you should put it, and whatever personal, professional reasons that may be. And I think that's the context. So if you read a CV and there's some cognitive disconnect, I don't know, you've been working at a very small school with completely unknown advisors, but you have 5 science papers. Well, maybe you need to explain this. I mean, it's not bad, but it's just that the person who reads it does not expect to see this. So, but otherwise, they're all can.
Just watching faculty working on search processes in the online systems where you kind of click on different buttons, I just think that most of them aren't actually going to the cover letter.
And then we haven't mentioned the research statement, but obviously in the research statement you are giving a perspective of what you've done and what you're doing next. Realize that you may be being read by a broad range of people who may not necessarily know you or what you've done. So in your research statement, you're giving them the context for that. You're not writing to specialists, you're writing to educated non-specialists potentially, not people who've spent as many years as you have working in your field, but people who know your field in general. So you have to give them a sense of why your work is important and where you're going next. So I think the research statement, you know, really, I mean, that's what makes you different. I mean, the first are sort of a path, and then the research statement is, well, who really are you? Are we interested in what we do?
And use figures effectively there.
I was going to say, and also, you know, that's the place where you separate yourself from your advisor, right? So that's where you say, this is my vision, this is what I'm thinking, great figures and schematics that are just easy to capture what you're trying to do, not so narrow that only the one specialist, who may be the chair of the search committee, but if you don't get the interest of the rest of the search committee, it's going to be a tougher sell. So vision and clearly where you're going that's distinct from what your advisor is working on, I think is a key point for your research statement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've talked a lot about, you know, that every search is going to be a little bit different, every department is going to look for some different things, but maybe from the opposite end, are there things that sitting on search committees or potentially in packets that you've submitted yourselves that are kind of red flags, you know, either, you know, easy ways to kind of weed out certain applications that people should avoid, or things that maybe you put in a packet before that you were going, I wish I would have never incorporated that? Are there kind of just general red flags that are very common that we see in either CV, teaching statements, research statements that that people should be aware of as they're writing these? Is there anything you guys can comment on about that?
So be careful of spelling and grammar.
Yeah, it was just especially teaching statement.
You'd be surprised, kind of even with spell check, how many people end up coming in with errors there, and it's just sloppy.
I think it's never a good idea to put manuscripts in preparation on your CV, because everybody lists 57 manuscripts in
Maybe
preparation.
one.
You know, I think not unless it's,
No,
maybe if it's submitted, and if it's submitted, you don't say what journal it's submitted
But you're
to.
putting it in the research statement.
It's in the
typically.
research statement, so you can list it to say, but I think if it's submitted, maybe you could list it, but definitely not in preparation. That's one of those things where you're trying too hard if you're doing that. So that's one thing.
I don't know. I mean, the manuscript in preparation can be mentioned in your advisor's reference letter, for instance.
Right.
And you could say, well, he or she is working on this really amazing work, and we're planning. And you know, maybe that person says it with more credibility than you. So if you want to mention this, so you know, write the letter. I don't really care if you say I'm good or not, but could you mention at least that we're working on it?
So we've talked about the different parts of the application that you submit typically online, which was like the research statement, your CV, letters of recommendation. But I think in the academic world, like most other job searches, what's most important are like back channels. And I'm wondering, like, how important is those really in the academic job search? Like, if my advisor is a really good name and he knows people and he puts in a good word for me, if I've met somebody through conferences and know them really well, and I say, hey, I'm applying for this job at your department, what role do those back channels play in siphoning applications and helping people get fast tracked, or do they make a difference?
They do make a difference. There's no question. It does not, it's not the only thing. So, but, I mean, I can tell you that we were all sent out to the top, at Society for Neuroscience, go to these posters, see these people. So, you know, for instance, when you're putting up a poster at Neuroscience, you think, I'm just doing a poster. No, you're on display. You know, people are checking you out. Every talk you give is a job talk, no matter where you give that talk. So you should have every talk be prepared, because somebody might hear it and they might tell somebody. If you recognize a name in the midst of a search, definitely helps a lot, you know. It's not everything. There's still got to be the goods there, and you have to match and blah, blah, blah. But,
And there's it shouldn't get crass either, right? There's advisors who call is not always good. At some point, pushing a candidate won't help either. It should stand out a bit on its own.
So I have a related question. So how do you follow up on an informal interview or talk invitation? So I'm early on in my postdoc, and I have a spouse relation to a place I'm targeting, and I got to go and give a talk this summer, and it was very positive, and people expressed interest. But I'm still early on in my postdoc, and so I'm not sure how to follow up on this opportunity. So I don't know if you guys have any advice.
I think definitely there's people that you're connected with about your science. You know, keeping in touch with them about what you're doing. Say if you have a paper that comes out or something like that gets accepted, you want to let them know that. You'd want to go see them at meetings and talk to them. Certainly sending thank you notes for sure.
Yeah.
You know, reminding, if you see them, remind them who you are. And you know, if you establish collaborations, that could be a good thing too.
Other questions?
In the back.
So I kind of have the opposite question of what was asked earlier, which was what not to do. I wanted to ask, what are sort of the things that make an applicant hot? So if you see an application, you read it, and you're like, wow, I really like this, I really like this. What are those things? What are the things that make you like an application?
The proposals. The proposals are really good, are smart, and if you read them and you can't find the mistakes blatantly in your face, then the ideas are good. That's really what makes a candidate stand out in a good department. A well-functioning department, that's what it should be.
And, sorry, is there another comment?
And then, of course, you know, the CV's got to be strong, so you've got to, you know, have already, you know, generated the record that's going to support, you know, having the strong research statement for the proposal. So, you know, you've got to have the publications already there to back that up too. You know, because you can have an interesting proposal, but if you've got one publication, people aren't going to believe that, you know, you're going to be capable of accomplishing it. And then you've got to have reference letters that are going to support the idea that you can accomplish it too. And you need to think a little bit about who those reference letters are going to be. Of course, it's going to be your PhD advisor and your postdoc advisor. And then generally you need at least one more. So I think all schools are going to require at least 3 and some up to 5. And so you need to think a little bit about who those other ones are going to be. And so, you know, the ideal case is to have some people who are very familiar with you and your work and, you know, think highly of you and are highly respected in your field and, you know, can have a, you know, high impact, you know, statement about you. And ideally, you know, are maybe not affiliated with one of your institutions. You know, if they know you from, you know, meetings and things, and you've interacted with them sufficiently that they really know you well enough, but they don't really have a buy-in to your success, that becomes a pretty high impact letter.
I think the research statements matter a lot and probably are different depending on what kind of job you apply to some degree. So if you're applying to a small college, a teaching college, for instance, and you better not have a proposal that relies on making, you know, large numbers of lines of genetically engineered mice, because it's probably not going to be feasible. with the time commitment and the financial commitment that you're going to get. So you have to make sure that your proposal is relevant for the job that you're applying to. But I do think this question of how to write that, I mean, this is the hardest part, right? Because everybody's research is different. How do you know that you have a really good idea and have you pitched it at the right level, and how much of it do you already have to have done, and how much of it should be the idea? And there's no formula for that. You know, sometimes they say, well, your first aim should obviously be what you're going to do is your first aim of your R01 to demonstrate that you can generate a grant, things like this. But in some places that's going to be appropriate, in some places it's not. So I think you just have to have them read a lot. I would say you present your research proposal a lot to people who go out and apply a lot, and have a lot of people read it and criticize it and tell you what they think about it. Because it's got to bling, it's got to just jump off the page at you, because you're going to read a ton of them. They're going to be all about 3 pages long. It's a lot of reading. So you've got to be able to just grasp it right away that it's exciting and interesting.
In most academic departments, you need a teaching statement. And so usually at a Research 1 institution, that's probably the lowest impact part of the application, honestly. But at a teaching college, that's probably going to be one of the higher impact pieces of the application. So you do have to remember that at different kinds of institutions, different pieces are going to have different amounts of impact.
And I want to go back to publications, because that's a question that was submitted a lot. So what kind of publication record are search committees looking for? Is it based on publications per year, or on the tier of the journal, or the impact factor? Do you have to have a science and a nature to get hired nowadays? Or
I can just comment on that from my perspective in our department. You know, obviously, if you have a cell science or nature paper, it's going to look good on your CV, and it's going to generate some enthusiasm, and then we sort of look at the letters and where you think you're going. And I can tell you, from my experience anyway, from the 6 years I've been here and all the candidates I've come through, is that 1 or 2 nature papers, we bring the person in, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and it's flat. And it's like, were you the person that really innovated here? Where did this come from? Because, you know, it's great on paper, but the seminar's flat, the depth isn't there, and that kind of thing. We hired, or at least the search I was on most recently, someone who didn't have a cell science or nature paper. I think her top paper was a PNAS paper. And the letters sang. I mean, the advisors were just absolutely not just supportive, but you know, they could articulate who this person was. I mean, I think it's actually really key. And so that complements a solid publication record. And I don't think number, at least in our department, is that important. I think the science should be exciting, and then proven solid success in graduate school and in postdoc. Typically, it's in 2 different fields, maybe related. And then, you know, and then you put that together with your research statement, and I think that sings. And that's actually the case in my, you know, from my application process too. I actually switched fields and then sort of came back. But if you can demonstrate that, you know, that solid publication record from each of those 2 periods, I don't think it's essential for cell science and nature. And I think that we've often gotten told that, you know, the lesson is that it's not a one-to-one, you know, with what you get with the impact factor of the journal. So that's my sense. I don't know if that's always.
We've had similar experiences where, you know, we've interviewed people from kind of really big name labs who had, you know, first doctorate science or nature papers, and when you actually interview them, they just really didn't live up to it. You know, they got the publication from the quality of the lab, but you know, the quality of the person didn't actually quite measure up. And so oftentimes, you know, you get much better people who might have, you know, publications in really good journals that are just the next tier down, the PNAS or you know, that level, but where their contributions will maybe much more integral and more important, and where their ideas are more robust. And so we haven't fixated on exactly which journals their publications are, and looked more at what their ideas are.
But no matter where you're going to submit your paper, if you haven't published yet, it's very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
So it's, you know, if there's a specific opportunity you have espoused and you're trying to get a job at the same place, you might, that's pretty much the main case where you might apply prior to having your papers published, and you're going to be saying exactly why you're doing this and be very ready to defend it. But if it's not published to the ideas of most people, it doesn't exist. So it's very tough if you haven't published it.
I have two questions. One is actually related to one of the previous ones about how to make your applications appealing. So one way that I've seen from my colleagues and other friends, listing names of people that you wish to collaborate in the future, either in the cover letter or research statement or whatever, is that considering all the politics that might be going on, as you say, in the committee, is that usually recommended things to do in general? Or if you do want to go that route, what should you look for? What should you try to avoid? So that's my first question. And then the second one is more general, which is, I don't think we have actually talked about steps of reviewing once the committee is formed. So you go from hundreds of applicants and then you make long list and short list. So can you go through, maybe it might be depending on different departments and universities, but at least is there like a generic form process to go through long list and short list?
So on the first question, as far as putting collaborators and things, I think in general, I mean, it does show that you have particular interest in that department and that you've gone to the step of, you know, really looking specifically at that department. And similarly, in a teaching statement, you could be, you know, calling out specific course numbers for that department and things. You know, that shows that you know, are genuinely interested in a particular department. Beyond that, I don't think it has a huge impact besides, you know, expressing, you know, a huge degree of interest that you have. So I don't think it has a huge impact on your paper application. Where I think it can be most helpful is doing it before you would go interview at a school, so that during your interview process, you can be talking about potential applications. Maybe in a chalk talk, you could be mentioning opportunities. You know, so I would definitely do that kind of work before going to visit a place.
So often reports, right, so the committee that interviews has to write a report that they present to the department, justifying their short list, right? And the short list, then the description maybe, well, you know, so this guy or this girl did this work there with this great guy, here's a sentence from the letter of recommendation. And in a place like Duke, especially chemistry in Duke, you know, where they see collaboration with the rest of campus as an integral part of them, they may mention, well, this candidate has a potential to collaborate with blah, blah, blah across campus. Okay? Now, you could do this work for them, but you may get it wrong, right? And if you get it wrong, it's going to hurt you, right? So if you just take a basic example, if you list a course that you think you'd like to be teaching, but this class has not been taught in 5 years, and you're thinking of reforming the undergraduate curriculum anyways, you know, you've wasted your opportunity. If you mention the names of people whom everyone hates on campus as a potential collaborator, because those people exist, right? You may just like, well, people will laugh at the files, like, did you see what he wrote? So I think there's a bigger risk of getting it wrong than the potential benefit of getting it right. So unless it's something you are very confident about, that someone you've already talked to, you know, and there's really a potential, I mean, so it needs to be very, very true. And then maybe. But
and
otherwise,
in all likelihood, you're going to be sending out dozens and dozens and dozens of these, and really doing enough work to potentially get it right is going to be difficult.
So on the second question, even in our department, we've done searches different ways. So sometimes we'll have 250 applicants come in, and the search committee is made up of, let's say, 6 people, and each of them split the stack, and they rate, or they split the stack twice. So 2 people see every stack, and then, you know, their ratings, and then basically that generates the short list with a number cut off, and that's it, except for maybe so-and-so's advisor kicked somebody's name into the short list because, when they reevaluated, that number should have been higher. But other times, the chair of the search committee goes through the whole thing and triages and says, okay, here's the top 30, and then the search committee meets and we say, okay, what's our short list going to be? So that's, even within our department, those are the two approaches I've seen.
I think the hardest thing is that if you do fall off the list at some point, it's very hard to get back on the list. So it's important not to get kicked off right away, for some, as you were pointing out, you don't want some red flag to just get you kicked off, even applying without publications or something. Or not having a letter arrive, not having your advisor's letter arrive is one way to not get considered also. If you're lucky, I was on a search committee once where I said, I called the person and said, you didn't send your letter yet, you should really make sure it's there. But otherwise, it's just like, oh, I got 200 applications, why am I going to consider this person just advisor didn't even bother to send a letter?
And from the advisor's point of view, if you've got a postdoc out applying and you've gotten like 69 requests for letters for them, it is easy to miss one on accident because, you get all these emails and you're trying to go through them. It's easy to accidentally have just skipped over one. So your advisor, it may not be totally their fault. It can just be, you've missed one button. But anyway.
Yeah.
But a lot of the online forms now allow you to track whether the letters have been submitted.
But yeah, if you have to go and remind your advisor, hey, this one tracks and says you didn't do it, it may just be that they missed a button. So.
But yeah, once they've gone through and said, okay, well, these are the people we're going to interview or something, and say you go out through the interview and say, well, we didn't like anybody, is there any way we should go back and look at it? It's very difficult to get anybody to agree to that at that point. So getting that early push from the advisor or making sure the letters are really strong the first time, letting them know if you do have a paper accepted in a major journal and that could make a big difference in how you look, you should communicate that. Because say that's the thing that jumps you from one list to the next, then you're going to be in the process. Don't wait until somebody happens to figure it out.
Or if they're at the point of trying to determine the 30 to the 3 or 4, that could impact where you fall on that cut.
Questions? Yes.
So if you had a position that you're very interested in, and you wanted to, say, find out who's on the search committee and then get in touch with the people and
They
try
usually
to build
won't tell you who
build
that
it.
is. Yeah.
Talk to people you know in the department and just make sure that you communicate that you're really interested in the job. But that behind the scenes, you can tell people, hey, I'm really interested in this job. I think I'm a perfect match. Explain to them why.
But not ask
But
who's
don't
the
ask
search
who the
committee
search
or anything like that.
And so you wouldn't follow, that one question submitted was can you follow up on the application? Hi, just checking in to see, or is that a no-no too?
So you could, it's mostly a no-no because, they've got hundreds of applications and it's mostly just kind of a pain in their side to keep getting these emails saying, hey, where's my application in the process? So it's mostly just an annoyance, I will say, having chaired search committees to keep getting these emails and you're saying, well, we'll let you know. So I would not be pestering them. I don't think there's much good to come from that. I would send them the updates of, hey, this paper just came out in Cell. There's the news on it. I would send them updates of that sort, and they will add that to your file. But I would not send, questions saying, where's your process? Where am I in this? I would not pester them with that kind of.
The only other exception I think I would make is if you have a good offer from a peer institution. So, you're applying to Duke and you get an offer from Stanford. That's fine. You're applying to Duke, you get an offer from, to your state college, don't bother letting me know. So, it's got to be a peer institution or a higher institution.
Yeah, but if you're applying to Duke and you have an offer from Stanford, if you haven't heard anything from Duke, I wouldn't bother contacting Duke. If you've already interviewed at Duke, it's okay to contact Duke and say, hey, I have this offer and, I need to let them know by this date. It's okay to then let Duke know that you've got some constraints. But, if you just haven't heard anything at all, don't contact them. That's, you're too far out of their process at that point. They're not going to get a process going fast enough for you at that point.
I just wanted to follow up on that. You said not to follow up these applications, what about if they don't have online letter tracking and stuff? Is it okay to follow up and say, have you received the materials, or is that also annoying?
You're probably following to an administrative person, so it's probably okay. It's not like the chair of the search committee is going to answer your email.
Sometimes we
Provided
do.
that there is
Yeah.
an administrative assistant. kind
Which
of
could be if
contact.
they, yeah.
Yeah, but even then, I would be hesitant to do too much, because remember, that person probably has something like 300 applications that they're trying to process and deal with. And so if 300 of you are calling and saying, are all my letters there, that's a big headache for them. And, so I would resist the temptation.
A lot of it does seem to be automated these days. As soon as you submit your letter, you get a letter back saying that your letter was received. And so even if you can't track it, you might write to your advisor and say, could you double check, did this letter get received at this institution?
I think the ones I did last year, I don't think I had any that weren't electronically submitted, so.
Questions? Let me ask one from the list. We've already asked a
There was
couple.
one in there.
If you get an official rejection, is it, I guess, appropriate to email for feedback?
Usually not.
I think that so often this is what you sort of heard this before. You shouldn't take it too personally, okay? You never even know what a search is looking for, what the issues are with the search committee. There's so many personal issues that can come on into these things, and money, and who the other people were, and just what people are interested in. I think that verbally, if you have a friend at the institution or somebody that you connected with on the interview, you could certainly email them and say, could you let me know what you think I can do to improve? Is there anything I did wrong? That kind of thing. It never hurts to ask people for criticism if you can take it, and try to use it to improve the presentation. But in general, even if people didn't like you, they're never going to say that. That's the thing. So I think it's, unless you have a personal connection.
And most of the times on the searches, it's usually that all the candidates are really good, and it's a matter of just figuring out which feels like the best fit for your department, more than some candidates had problems. So usually on the candidates you don't choose, there aren't really things where you can go to them and say, here are your problems, you need to go fix them. So usually there's not a whole lot of feedback you would give them to help them go improve. It's usually just that you're looking at a bunch of really exceptionally talented people and trying to figure out which one you think fits best into your particular program.
I'll give you a personal touch to this. So when I was in the job market, I applied to a school which I thought was pretty bad, but was in a place where I really wanted to be. And I was a perfect fit for the description. And I figured, well, this is my safety school, right? If I don't get any job, at least I get to go there. And within 2 weeks, I received a rejection letter. And this was the first rejection letter I got of this entire season, and I was very depressed. I went to see my advisor. I was like, well, I think it's not going to look too good. And in his response, he was a very nice guy, and he turned to me and says, there's a reason they're not a good school. And so, but what I found out years later is that actually they had an advertisement out, and they were looking for tenure track faculty in my field. But really what they wanted to do is hire senior people. And they didn't interview the junior people, and therefore all junior applicants who applied, well, they were just automatically. And there's no way I could have known this, and it really affected me at the time, right? I was really, it's a tough process. But this is what's going on behind this. And you can't, sometimes, there's no feedback to that.
So how about, this is kind of a related question, if life happens, if you for some reason don't, you and your advisor, your postdoc advisor don't get along, or if you take time out to have a baby, is this something that you should address head on in your cover letter, or how do you finesse those kinds of situations?
So the issue with you and your postdoc advisor not getting along can be difficult because of the fact that if it was significant enough that you're going to get a bad recommendation letter, then you probably need to not ask this person for a letter, which is going to then create some red flags kind of in your whole application. And it may be a significant enough issue that you need to be doing a second postdoc. It may be a significant enough issue that you should have gotten out of that postdoc way early and jumped ship to a postdoc way early. Yeah, so
I would say unless you can trump it with a letter from someone senior and respected in the field and or someone that knows colleagues at the institution where you're applying, because there can be certain factories that, there are mature postdocs that butt heads but are successful in their projects and get the papers, and they're very capable, but the advisor may have, and maybe the advisor is known for this kind of behavior, maybe not. And I think a letter from a senior peer, of your advisor could actually trump it and make it okay.
yeah, and it
It's
depends
rare case, but
too on how significant it was, because sometimes you may not have enjoyed your relationship with your postdoc advisor, but your postdoc advisor may have perfect respect for you as a scientist, and your letter from them is going to be fine. And that's a whole different scenario. In that case, everything is going to be okay. You may not like your advisor, but that doesn't really matter. The case where your advisor doesn't respect you as a scientist and isn't going to write you a good letter is a very big problem.
With respect to the time off, what matters most is your accomplishments. And that should be front and center. Your accomplishments should be front and center. The way you accomplish them is your own story. You may wish to explain a gap in your CV, for instance. That's fine, you can explain that. But don't make that the first letter of your cover letter. Make the first letter, I do this, and this is exciting because of the following. In the fourth paragraph, you can put, by the way, you might notice that I was away for 2 years and this is the story. But remember, that's fine. You can explain we all have lives, life happens. What matters is your accomplishments and your community.
Yeah, so starting the follow-up of this time off, so let's say, like my CV right now, it's not that I really had time off, but it was a time off from the north. So I have a 3-year research and teaching experience in the south. And I know this because of talking with search committee member, department chair, that we had this conversation. Some people sort of consider it like I was doing nothing during this time because I was in the south and I don't have the papers, and it's very difficult to actually get a recommendation letter from there because not everybody's going to write it in English because people are going to write it. They probably don't have a PhD, so it's not going to be, so there's a lot of these good choices, but there's a lot of accomplishments during those 3 years that they're being considered as a time off in my city. So, I could put a lot of things in my cover letter there, but I'm just wondering if if I should just find somebody over there that's willing to write a letter in English, but this person is not going to probably might have a master's in science and could have been my direct supervisor anyway over there. But so how would you, as a committee search, look at the reference letter of somebody that had a lot of accomplishments in the South situation, but the reference letter is coming from somebody with a lower degree? There's these complications. And I was told that for some people that was a big issue. Some other
I
understood.
think the bigger issue is the lack of publications from that year. Those years. I don't think it matters where you were. I think the issue is that you didn't publish.
Yeah, but if you don't know, it's just, it's just because of the nature of the way science goes. It just happen.
No, I completely agree, right? In the sense of the scientific community, it's not just the search committee, it's the scientific community as a whole. In that sense, that gap, if you didn't publish anything, you did nothing.
Yeah, but you supervise.
You may have grown enormously in an individual, and maybe the research that you did afterwards is so much more stellar because of it, and this is what will shine for you. But those 3 years effectively are not helping.
Yeah, but for instance, in this situation, I supervised 12 undergraduate dissertations. So I have 12 undergraduates that were directly supervised. They're not counting.
But none of them published, right?
Well, yeah, because
So-
it's just,
Well, it's teaching experience. So I mean, that's the thing, you gotta turn it into what it is. Realize some people are gonna have gaps in their CV because they did a residency. Okay, they didn't publish necessarily during the residency either, but you can imagine that doing a residency, seeing patients, that has informed the type of work that they do because they have that clinical training. In your case, if this experience, it sounds like maybe it was involved in mentoring and teaching, you need to build that into the core of what that experience is. I do think you need a letter that would support it. Realize we don't know who anybody is. Like as soon as you move away from your institution, you don't know who anyone is, so it doesn't matter what their reputation is. What matters is what they say. It matters what they say about who they are, what their responsibilities are, how they know you, and what you did when you were there. That matters, that it's a strong letter that way. I don't care what degree they have because I'm not even going to know what it means, right? So you know, that can all be communicated. So it sounds like you had a reasonable experience that you can convince somebody what it was about, but you know, it's not going to be obvious because there weren't these obvious publications. But spin it for us.
Yeah. So a lot of, you know, science engineering is very interdisciplinary. So, you know, just as an example, say, you know, for biomedical engineering, you probably receive applicants from mechanical engineering or biology, or what are your primary concerns? Or, you know, what sort of things should you put on an application if you're applying in a field related but outside of your own, you know, to overcome any hesitations that they might have?
So, you know, when I was an assistant professor, I applied to 6 different kinds of, or I interviewed in 6 different kinds of departments. I probably applied to even more than that. And, you know, I think that there were generally no qualms. I think when you're doing your teaching statement is probably where people have the most concerns. They want to make sure in an academic department that you're going to be able to teach the classes. You know, so you need to make sure that you're tailoring your teaching statements for every kind of department that you're applying to. So if you don't have a degree in that particular discipline, you need to make sure that you're making it clear that you can teach the classes that they need to have taught. So that's the biggest thing. I think that research is so interdisciplinary that, you know, people can very clearly believe now that, you know, assuming that your research statement has some fit, that in general they can look at research statements and see how things could potentially fit in many different kinds of departments. But where hang-ups still come kind of with disciplinary boundaries comes mostly with the teaching.
And again, there's a cultural aspect of this, right? There are departments that see themselves as needing to build their core, and others that need to expand outside of their core. And at any given time, a department can flip from one to the 2 states or be somewhere in between. And when you apply, you don't know this, but in a sense, it's part of the noise, and so you need to apply in many different places to try to beat that noise. But the thing to retain is that if you are very multidisciplinary, there are some departments that will be receptive to this, and the ones that are not receptive to it, maybe you shouldn't want to convince them to be receptive to it because you will be miserable after, right? So Duke is a place that strongly encouraged multidisciplinarity, and when I interviewed here, I mean, actually on the spot they changed my schedule when they realized that maybe it would be more appropriate for me to meet other people than the ones that they thought originally. But I went to another school after this, and I also felt I should meet other people from other department, and they said, "Oh, no, we don't do this here." And then so immediately, right, you get the feel, and that's important for how you're going to be working later. So you want to be marketable, you want to be good, you want to, but if you're really in between 2 fields, like in between chemistry and physics, you want to be in a place where that's welcome.
I have a question related to gaps on the CV. So in my situation, after I graduated, I stayed in my same PhD lab for another 2 years. I worked on something completely different from what I did during my thesis, and I published a decent paper. And so then I moved on, and you know, for my current postdoc, and I'm doing something more related to that publication than you know, than my PhD thesis. And so the question is this publication going to count for a search committee as part of a postdoc publication? No.
I think it'll work beautifully in your research statement, it sounds like, as to why you're doing what you did now, but...
Yeah, it's kind of an introduction to my current postdoc, which is how I got here. but
Sounds a little, it sounds like, I mean, you could try it. You could see what happens if you apply, but it sounds like you would be best off having a publication. I don't know how many years it's been either, is another question.
Sorry?
How many years?
So 2 years in my previous job, a little less than 2 years, and
Since your paper came out?
no, so my paper came out like 3 months after I left the lab.
Yes, it's been a little while.
So while we're in the sort of the problem section, when is the appropriate time to let the search committee know that you have a partner who's also, a spouse or partner who's also looking?
So there's no right answer to that, I would say. And to some degree, I think it's going to depend a lot on kind of the department and the department chair and the culture of the school, and unfortunately you usually don't know that ahead of time. I would probably not bring it up until you've already been invited for an interview.
You're very likely to get asked at the interview, because we all do this, just, you know, you're trying to make like conversation. So, you have a picture of somebody, you know, what do they do, you know? So, and I don't think it's ever good to lie. I mean, if you ask a question, you should just be honest about it. That's not being pushy at all.
There's some schools where it's forbidden. In a lot of public school, it's actually
it's
forbidden.
illegal.
It's actually like,
complicated.
yeah, you technically cannot be asked
Right.
if you are married, or, but
But it comes
nonetheless, you will be asked everywhere you go. And if you say, you cannot ask me, I mean, it's just very awkward.
The other person will blush and go, oh my God. But they're not trying, I mean, it's illegal to force to push somebody, but yeah, in conversation, it's going to happen, so. And by the time that you've been interviewed, they are interested in you. It's a hook, right? And so
if they want to hire you, right, they're going to have to figure out how to address this issue. And from a department chair's perspective, it takes a long time to figure out how to make this second position. And so when you extend an offer and then they suddenly say, oh, and by the way, you've got to come up with a second position, it's really late. And to go out and oftentimes that's off in some other department, maybe in some other school, you know, maybe you have to go work with the School of Architecture or something, and, you know, and you've got to go have all these negotiations with people that you've never met before, and you know, it can be a process that takes a really long time. So waiting until you actually have the offer, which could be the safest point to tell them that you have a spouse, because at that point you have the offer, they can't rescind it. Right? So that is technically the safest point to tell them about the existence of your spouse. So, you know, so there is a reason why you might want to wait to that point. That would be the safest point to tell them. So, but from the department chair's perspective, you know, that is a very difficult point for the department chair to learn about it, because it is so hard at that point to go and make that second position happen. Because it is so late in the year, and there's so little time, and most of the university resources have already been committed to other things, and it's just so difficult to get that other position to come together at that point. So from the department chair perspective, if you could go ahead and let them know at the point that you start interviewing, even though there's always that risk that maybe it clouds the decision, you know, hopefully it doesn't, but maybe it does. You know, in the school that really wants you, it's going to give them more time and flexibility to pull everything together and make everything happen for you. So it's a little bit of a risk, but that's my perspective on it.
And some schools handle it better than others again, and that will be reflected in how you bring it up, right? If you bring it up and you get a very cold reaction, maybe you don't want to be there anyways. I mean, obviously it's not a buyer's market, so it's really or it's not an applicant's market, so it's hard to say, but there's a cultural aspect to this.
I have 3-4 connected questions that more stupid but more challenging questions. I want to know this search query perspective on an applicant who is not a resident in this country and does not have a green card or residency. Who has 2 postdocs rather than 1 postdoc. 3rd, who is from industry, not from academia. And 4th, if he or she graduated from the same school, he is applying for a faculty position.
And that's a friend of yours, right?
Make it a little joke. It's not you, it's your friend.
It's a friend.
So I would say that we generally have not worried about immigration status at all. We just ignore that and deal with it later. As far as number of postdocs, we haven't worried about that. We just look at the overall productivity.
And that may depend by field.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat different in different fields, the acceptability of that.
Right. And
Industry
probably
as well.
if we got to
Yeah.
like 3 and 4 postdocs, we would get concerned. 2 postdocs has been pretty normal, not a big deal. Industry has been okay as long as publications have been allowed. There have been some companies where everything's been kept as trade secrets and publications have been blocked. And people coming from some of those companies have had problems. So, you know, it's been kind of it depends. So,
And applying back to the same school where you're a grad student is fine. Applying back to the same school where you're a postdoc is problematic. Usually you're separated farther in distance from what your graduate advisor did. The issue is overlap. How similar are you to what's going on and how much conflict is there? I know a number of people hired back to the institutes where they were grad students. And in fact, we sometimes specifically interviewed them because often people know you. So it can often be a leg up. Applying to the institute where you're postdoc, that causes a potential conflict. I've seen it work, but it's way more problematic. More at bigger institutions where you might be really separated in different departments or different hospitals, say in a big institution. But for grad school, probably not such a big issue. I can't think of an example where it would be a problem. Maybe you guys can.
there are some institutions that actually try and keep their postdocs. I don't think it's a good idea, but
Not typically tenure track.
Not typically tenure track.
And it depends again how the institution sees itself, right? So there's 2 different families of hiring strategies. You build on what you already have, or you do something new. Now, if you're in a department where the department feels that they need to do something new, and you're applying, and you already have your former advisor, that's going to raise a lot of red flags, and people may not want to consider you just on principle. Like you overlap, therefore you're not good. And there are other places where this is great, right? We are building a core, we need a critical mass, we want 20 of you. But that depends. And the 2 models are successful, and 2 of them depends on where you are.
Yes.
So I have a question about the length of postdoc. Say I just finished my first year, and I'm thinking whether I should start going on the job market right now with only 2 publications for my postdoc, or whether I should, make sure to add another year and try to get a couple more publications, and then apply.
What field are you in?
Chemistry.
Say again?
Chemistry.
It depends
Where
what
did you
field.
publish? Where did you publish?
Where did I publish? Well, in grad school I published in Nature, but so far in, I guess, JAX and JCP.
And you have a lot of exciting work to talk about.
you can give an hour-long seminar that would be really awesome.
You know what you're going to do next? You have
You want to hire me?
These are the questions. Yeah, I mean, in different fields, it takes different amounts of time. That's the idea. Once you know that you have the next step in mind, you know what it is, you're going to differentiate from the lab you came from, you have enough data to write your first R1, you know what that's going to be based on, then fine.
Well, it may not be an hour.
R1.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, it's like first grant,
I
whatever.
still have some money.
But yeah, so it depends on your field.
Is there actually something when people bring money that's like an automatic way in?
Not always,
Yeah.
but it helps.
Probably depends on institution, department, how the position is structured.
So, and one of the things that I counsel people when they're thinking about applying when it might be a little early is maybe to do a round of applications to a more limited number of schools, just to the ads that look most exciting to them. And then with the idea that, you know, if something hits that's great, that's wonderful. And if not, then the next year they'll do their real search.
So this is one of the mistakes my postdoc did, for instance. He saw something that he thought was a really, really bad job offer, so he should apply for it. Because it's, you know, it's early. I was like, well, no, you never do this. You only apply to school where you could potentially go, and you would potentially go. If you take it as a joke, you become the laughing stock. So I like what, I'm happy that you said this, right? If something is really exciting to you, these are the ones maybe you can consider going early and see if it works. Not the opposite.
Okay, we've got time for one final question, yes.
I guess for all of you, what would be something, having gone through the process or having seen your postdocs go through the process, some things that you could reflect back on and wish you had done differently or wish you had known about, maybe like tips that you could give us when we go on the application process and job market?
I think the seminars, I mean, if you're at the point of interviewing, I don't know where we started here, but let's say you get your foot in the door and you're interviewing, I think the more, if you can give an exciting seminar and get people on board that weren't on the search committee, they're in the department, but they're stakeholders, that's huge. And critically important. And I think really being engaged in one-on-ones, I mean, I think if you don't know what the people that you meet with are doing and don't care, that's not going to reflect well when it actually comes time to deciding, who's supporting it and not. And there can be big, diverse departments, and so you may not care about something that's off, but that person's on your schedule, but that person may actually have a lot of influence in the department. Or even if they don't, they may speak up and say, God, she was sleeping in the morning, in our one-on-one because I don't know what you guys did for dinner last night, but it'll reflect really poorly on you. None of these things happened to me. I was just on that side.
I think because we're talking about the application today, I have to say, I mean, the research statement is the most unusual part of the application. The CV is pretty straightforward. As we said, the cover letter people may or may not read. The letters of recommendation, you need to choose people to write them, but then they write them. But the research statement is unique. It's personal. And it matters. And the thing is, you probably ought to have a lot of people read it and give you their feedback because, your advisor, I remember when my postdoc applied, and I would read it, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's just what we're writing all the time. It's the same thing we're writing all the time. But that's because we're so into it. Like, we know every little intricate detail of it. But you don't know how that looks to somebody who hasn't been thinking about this for the past 6 years, So I think that getting other people to read it and give you their sense, because it's going to be read very broadly by broad committees, and so getting as many people as you can to give you feedback onto the idea is really worth spending the time in the document.
Don't trust people who tell you it's good.
Yeah, if they don't say anything, they're not giving you enough.
Find someone who can really trash it.
Then you're going to have to turn that document basically around into a chalk talk where you're going to have to give in most departments, kind of a talk about those ideas and how you're going to develop that into your research program. So you can be thinking about that kind of 3-page document as the basis for probably like a 40-minute talk or something on kind of the future of your research program. So be kind of thinking about that as the outline for your chalk talk too.
And that's an excellent cliffhanger for our next panel discussion next week on the interview. So let's thank our panelists.